Hey, what's up everyone? Foxy here, and today we're going to be talking about ailments. Now, ailments in Last Epoch are absolutely busted, no change there in Season 2. And I think it's really important to understand how they work, even if you're following a build guide, just to work out where your damage is coming from. So, ailments is really complex, but this guide aims to explain it in very simple terms. And as we get further into the, I'm going to call it presentation, it's going to get more complex, so people who are maybe more advanced can also gain something out of this as well. But we'll start simple and work our way up. So first of all, these on the screen are some of the big contenders, the usual suspects of dot damage, like, ignite, poison, bleed, damned, etc. Now, in Last Epoch, different to PoE, the base damage of a ailment will never change. So ignite will always be 40. And the damage type they belong to can also be slightly different to the name of the ailment. So poison is poison damage. Ignite, however, is fire damage. Okay, nice and simple. Next, we have the duration of the ailment. So this is how long the ailment lasts for. And the 40 damage for Ignite is applied over 2.5 seconds. People get confused by that. It's not per second, it's over the course of it. And finally, the stack limit. So for the big boys, the Ignite, Poison, Bleed, unlimited stacks. The only limitation is how fast you can apply them and how long they last. And then you get some occasional ones that have a stack limit, and they generally have a higher base damage. For example, Time Rock has 60 base, but you can only get 12 stacks of it. There are so many more dots than this, by the way. And dots means damage over time, for those who might not know. There's so many in Last Epoch, it's crazy. But these are some of the big ones, and they all work kind of the same way. So, moving on, what are the rules of ailments? All damage in Last Epoch is either a hit or it's a dot. It's always one or the other. Ailments are not spells. They do not scale with spell damage. Very important to know. People always get this wrong. The base damage of a dot can't be increased, as I mentioned. Again, people believe it can. It can't. Not in Last Epoch. It can in PoE, but not in Last Epoch. Any hit can apply any ailment you have a chance to apply. So this is, again, different from Half of XL. If you have a chance to apply something, anything that does a hit in your arsenal will potentially apply that ailment, which is crazy good. That's awesome in Last Epoch, and I love this. It's really fun. Okay, so how do we scale our dot damage? First of all, we look at scaling tags. So every skill in Last Epoch has things called scaling tags, and these things kind of show you what increases on your gear, your passivity, or the skill itself will scale that particular type of damage. So there's things called damage types, so that's your poison, your fire, your lightning. If you've got increased fire damage and the skill does fire and the ailment does fire, then increases of fire damage would increase the initial hit of the skill. So in the case of Chaos Bolts, that's that 10 fire and 10 necrotic damage you can see under base damage as the hit. And then also it will scale the ignite, which is a fire type, on the actual stacks of the dot that you're putting on the enemy. So this is a really useful tool as a first start to see what does it. There's also things like skill mechanics, so it'll say whether it's like a melee or a spell. Remember, with spell, it's only the initial hit that it will increase the damage of. So spell damage will only increase the hit of the Chaos Bolts, but it won't increase the amount of damage the ailments do, because spell damage does not apply to ailments, it only applies to hits. Area is the size of the area that the skill is hitting, and your attributes can also scale both the initial hit and the ailments depending on the skill. And of course, anything that says increases damage over time will increase your damage over time ailments. Nice and simple. So what about your mechanics? So that's one way of scaling the damage. But another almost as important, if not more important way, is some of the mechanics of applying these dots, right? So the faster you cast, the faster you attack, the more stacks of these dots you can have. So if one stack does 50 damage, two stacks does 100, you can see the faster you apply it, the better. The sister or brother to this is duration. So the longer the duration, basically the more stacks you can have at any one time on the enemy. And this is really big. People overlook this. So something that's 25% longer in Last Epoch, or duration-wise, is basically doing 25% more damage. So that's a multiplier. You've also got things like penetration reducing resistances. You could call this the cousin of the other two. Basically, instead of improving yourself, you make the enemies worse, so they take more damage from the things that you're putting on them. And then chance to apply, I don't have an analogy for this one, it's just the chance to apply something. So anything that hits, if you've got a chance to apply lightning, the electrify ailment, then if you've got that, any spell or attack that hits has a chance to apply that ailment. Now, I just wanted to specifically talk about duration, because people get really confused on this. So increasing your dot duration affects the entire amount of damage you do, it does not affect the amount of damage you do per second. Now, at first, that's a really confusing sentence. So let me break this down. If Ignite does 40 damage over 2.5 seconds, which it does, that's 16 damage per second. Now, let's say I double that duration. Well, it will do 80 damage over 5 seconds, but that will still be 16 damage per second. So the individual damage per second doesn't change, but the amount of damage that entire one stack of the ailment does has doubled. And that's important. And we'll see why in the damage calculations later in the thing, those people who like maths. But we're going to stick away from maths for now, okay, guys? So don't worry, no maths yet. We'll give a math warning later. Okay, just some very quick things on what increased and more damage mean. So your base damage is the starting damage. Increased damage multiplies your base damage, but is additive with other sources of increased damage. And then more damage multiplies your base and added damage, and is multiplicative with everything. That's a hard word. With everything. So, what's the best things? Base damage is huge. Doubling your base damage doubles your damage. More damage, also huge. Increased damage is okay. You kind of want to go for more and increased base damage, but as dots can't increase their base damage, and you can't add damage to the base of your dots, you're basically stuck with increased and more damage with ailments. So a little bit of mass here. Don't panic. Just a tiny bit of mass just for visual people. 50% more damage does this on the calculation. So you can see if I had two sources of 50% damage, increased damage, you'd go 0.5 plus 0.5, and that'd equal 20. Whereas more damage is 1.5 times 1.5. Okay, so that's where it differs. That's why you get more damage. So more damage, big good. Okay, I hope that was okay for the people who ain't maths. Moving on. So, how does it work? So say we cast Chaos Bolts with a chance on our passive tree to apply Poison, Ignite, and Damned. We'll break this into two: the initial hit and then the ailments. So the initial hit, as you can see by the arrow, does 10 fire damage and 10 necrotic damage base. If we look at the scaling tags, this hit scales with fire, it scales with necrotic, spell damage, intelligence, and area. We won't worry too much about area, but it scales with the others. So anything that increases your fire, your necrotic, spell, or intelligence on your passive, your gears, or the skill will increase that initial hit, that damage, in line with the damage type. So if you've got increased fire damage, that increase the 10 portion of the fire damage. If you have increased necrotic damage, that increase the necrotic portion of that damage. And we'll again do mass later for those who want to see that for real. And then you've got the ailments. So this is where it gets a little bit more confusing. So in this case, we've said we're applying Poison, Ignite, and Damned. The Ignite will scale on this skill with the fire and the intelligence. As it says, every 1 intelligence, you'll get 4% increased Ignite damage. You also get whatever increased fire damage you have on your gear, etc. The Poison will not scale with intelligence, as this spell does not have a poison tag, but it will scale with things like your gear and your passive trees, etc. And the Damned, because it has the necrotic tag, will scale with the necrotic damage and the intelligence that your character has. Hopefully that makes sense. So simply put, you can divorce the two. You can think of the initial hit and the amount of damage that does, and then what ailments the hit applies have their own damage calculations separately. Now, I warn you, we're going to do some examples. There's going to be some maths here, but for those who kind of want to understand or just listen along, I'll explain it in words and then also show the sums as well. So for those who care about the maths, they can see it, but for those who just want to understand the gist of it, they'll understand that as well. So here we go. Hang on tight. Okay, so say we cast Chaos Bolts with a chance on our passive tree to apply the Poison, the Ignite, and the Damned. Let's say on our skill, gear, passives, whatever, we have 20 added fire damage, 50% increased spell damage, 100% increased fire damage, 200% dot damage. You guys can read. Basically, these stats at the top. Okay, so for the initial hit, this is nothing to do with the ailments. This is just the initial hit of Chaos Bolts, which has 10 fire and 10 necrotic as the base damage. You'd add the fire damage base to the added fire damage. Then you'll do the increase, so you're times by the increased spell damage plus the increased fire damage plus the increased damage from intellect, and then you're times by the more fire damage. And then you get this sum that you can see here, equaling 130.5 fire damage total. For the necrotic, it's simpler, because at the top you can see we've only got, scaling wise, the base necrotic damage. We've got the increased spell damage and the increased damage from intellect. We don't have anything else at the top that would increase this. But if you had on your gear, for example, increased necrotic damage, this would then land in the increased bucket. If you had more necrotic damage, that would land in the more bucket, but we don't have that in this example. So hopefully that makes sense. I try to keep it simple. 135 damage would go to the enemy, and then 19 necrotic damage would also go to the enemy. Now the juicy bit, the bit we actually care about, how do the ailments work? So we'll take the ailments one by one. So in an example at the top, we're saying our damage only is benefiting from intellect and the dot damage in this sum. So we ignore the added fire damage, doesn't matter to us. It's not a spell, it's an ailment, so we ignore the spell damage. We ignore the fire damage. It's purely the dot damage and the intelligence that's going to affect the damage, because it had intelligence on the scaling tag. Per point of intellect, 4% increased damage. So that's basically 4% times 10. That's 40% increased damage. And then increased dot damage is 200%. So there you can see in the sum, we take the base of 35. We take the 0.4, which is the 40% from intellect, and the 200% from the dot damage. And then, stay with me here, guys. Hang on. We divide by the duration to get the damage per second. So that's 47.6 necrotic damage. Hopefully that makes sense. We're going to move on to the next one. Poison damage. Now, in this case, the spell has no scaling with poison whatsoever. But when the spell hits, it will apply a stack of poison damage potentially based on your poison chance. We've said we've got poison chance. So if we apply a stack of poison, what you're going to get is the base poison damage times whatever increased dot damage you have on your gear, which is 200% in this case, divided by the duration. Again, if you had increased poison damage, you would also get that chucked into the sum, and if you had more poison damage, that would also get chucked in the sum. But again, we're not using that in this example. And then we move on finally to the most complex one, which is the ignite damage per second. And it's not more complex because of the ailment, it's just more complex because of the scenario. So we ignore the added fire damage because you can't increase your base damage of your ailments. You get your base damage of 40. You times it by the increased fire damage, which applies, because the scaling of fire applies to ignite. The damage from intellect, which we just explained, plus the increased dot damage times the more fire damage. Okay? And then we also have, in this scenario, 100% increased duration of ignite. So we basically double the duration. So again, we've got the sum below. We have 40 plus the fire damage, which is 100%, plus the 40% intellect, plus the 200% dot, times the more fire damage, times the duration, which is 2, basically doubling it, and then divide by 5, because the total duration when doubled goes from 2.5 to 5 seconds, because ignite has a 2.5 second duration. And that equals 105.6 ignite damage per second per stack. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. I just wanted to add a few more additional bits of information here, which is additional modifiers. These are kind of things that do affect the damage of dots, but don't directly necessarily... It was too complex to put them into the sums, but they do apply to the sums. So things like monster resistance. If a monster has a resistance of 75% of whatever type of damage you're doing of the elements, so if I have 75% fire damage and I put an ignite stack on it, only 25% of my ignite damage is going to hurt the monster. But if I had, say, resistance and shred, or resistance reduction, two things that can occur in Last Epoch, you basically take away whatever resistance, shred, or reduction that is from the total resistance. So let's say a monster had 125% poison resistance, I shred 50% of it off, he now only has 75% resistance. Okay? And the cap is 75 anyway, so that would effectively do nothing. It would still take 25% damage because they can't resist over 75%. It's just not possible. So that basically did nothing. But then let's say we have penetration. Now, penetration is calculated just after the resistance is calculated. So you do the sum above, and then you would subtract the penetration. Say we then had 10% penetration of poison. We just moved it down to 75 with the resistance. The penetration is going to do the last push and take that to 65% resistance. So now we are doing 35% of our total damage of the ailment to the enemy. And this can actually go completely negative, and then it actually starts multiplying the damage you're doing to the enemy, which is huge. Finally, we've got effectiveness. This is quite confusing, so I've kind of left it to the end. This is a multiplier to applied damage from stats, e.g. if you had plus 10 spell fire damage, and for a particular spell, that spell had 500% effectiveness of fire damage, you would times that 10 by 5 and you get 50 additional fire damage. This is kind of less applicable to many ailments, but there is some edge cases where this could affect them. So I wanted to keep this video a bit shorter than my usual. Hopefully this has been helpful. I think the key things to think about ailments is basically split them from the hit. And remember, spell damage does not affect ailment damage. Your gear does affect ailment damage. The scaling tags, depending on the scaling tag, will affect the ailment as well. But most of the time, for scaling ailments, you want to look at damage over time. That will scale any ailment. Then the type of damage that particular ailment does. So for Ignite, you're wanting to scale the fire damage for those dots. Then you're looking at penetration to reduce your enemy's resistances. You're looking at duration to make those stacks last longer. You're looking at attack and cast speed to apply more stacks of those quicker. All these things sort of build upon themselves and equals some very dead monsters. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope that's been helpful. It's a little bit more nerdy than usual, but I mean, come on, we're playing Last Epoch. Hopefully this has been fun though, and if you like more of these, I can do more guides similar to this. As usual, I still haven't got an outro to this, so I guess I'll stop here. Remember to like and subscribe if you liked and subscribed this. That's not a sentence, but yeah, if you like this, like it. If you want to subscribe. Foxy out. Bye for now. Bye.